Welcome to the Banner of Truth magazine podcast, where each week we bring you selected content from the magazine for your encouragement and edification. This week, we're going to look at the life and ministry of Thomas Guthrie, the great 19th century Scottish preacher and social reformer. To help us do that, we're going to turn to the June 2013 issue of the Banner of Truth magazine, number 597, and to an article there by Andrew Murray, entitled Thomas Guthrie, Preacher and Philanthropist. We're very grateful to Andrew Murray for reading his article for us.
Thomas Guthrie's statue in Princess Street Gardens, Edinburgh, epitomises what many of us involved in Christian social action are seeking to achieve. With the Bible in one hand and the other resting protectively on a ragged child, Guthrie's life combined the two great priorities of the church, truth and love. It is a mystery why such a significant figure has fallen into such obscurity. Not one of Guthrie's books is currently available apart from in rather unattractive print-to-order formats. Such books as Seed Time and Harvest of Ragged Schools and The City, Its Sins and Sorrows are incredible exhortations to biblical community engagement, and yet they are only to be found online or in second-hand bookshops. Guthrie's autobiography and memoirs, written by him and completed by his sons, is without doubt the most exciting, moving, humorous and stimulating book I have ever read. But to my knowledge, it has never seen a modern reprint. We have much to learn from this great man, particularly on the subject of biblical community engagement. There was never a time when we needed this more, and Guthrie has much to teach us. Standing at over 6 feet tall, Guthrie was an imposing figure. Born in July 1803 in the town of Brecon, the son of a local merchant and banker, Thomas Guthrie was the second youngest of 13 children. His father David and mother Clementina lost 3 children in infancy, their surviving 10 children being made up of 3 daughters and 7 sons. It is interesting for us to look back through nearly 200 years of history and seek to understand what made Guthrie the remarkable man he became. Guthrie talks very tenderly in his writings of one of his mother's sisters, Miss Betty Kay, who stayed with the Guthrie family. We read that, quote, she was somewhat deformed but had a beautiful expressive face, unquote. While she ate with the family, she spent most of her time in her own room reading Thomas Boston's Fourfold State and Isaac Ambrose's Looking to Jesus. On New Year's Day, she would call Thomas and his brother Charles into her room for some wise counsel, a 6pence, and, horror of horrors for a young boy, a kiss. 60 years later, the elderly Guthrie writes, quote, the counsels I fear we did not mind much, the kiss we disliked, and though we valued the 6pence, our estimation of it was much abated by her insistently resuming it to place it on our credit in the savings bank. End of quote. This, it would appear, is one of the many influences on Guthrie that led him to have such an empathy with the marginalised. At age 4, Guthrie was sent with his older brother to a tutor called Jamie Stewart, who was a local weaver. Stewart was part of the Secession Church, which broke away from the Church of Scotland in 1733. Members were often known for their seriousness and strictness, but Guthrie remarked that, quote, he, Stewart, was no ascetic, no sour and unhealthy Christian, but enjoyed and encouraged others to enjoy innocent recreations, end quote. Guthrie says at this stage he was a thoughtless boy, but the prayers of his tutor made a huge impression on him. He would have heard Stewart praying as Guthrie's mother attended the local Secession Church and took the children with her. In his own inimitable way, Guthrie says of his tutor in prayer, quote, with a remarkable knowledge of his Bible and perfect mastery of its language, he so interwove its sublimest passages into his prayers that they seemed like the utterance of a seraph before the throne, end quote. Guthrie went on to study at Edinburgh University at the tender age of 12. As he himself comments in his autobiography, beyond the departments of fun and fighting, I was in no way distinguished at college. After 4 years of philosophy and literature, and then a further 4 of theology, Guthrie undertook a further 2 years in which he studied chemistry, anatomy, and natural history. It was during this time that Guthrie attended the lectures of the famous Dr. Knox, who was connected to the Burke and Hare murders. Despite clear ability, Guthrie had to wait a frustrating 5 years for a charge. These years were not wasted. Guthrie enrolled in the Sorbonne in France to study during the winter of 1826-27. He certainly saw another side of life in Paris and summed it up by saying, "Paris is the best place in the world for pursuing any science, saving those of morality and religion." Returning to Brechin in March 1828, he worked in his father's bank, the Dundee Union Banking Company, for several years before finally receiving a call to Aberloot, Angus, in 1830. The manager of the bank's head office in Dundee said to Guthrie on one occasion, quote, "If you only preach, sir, as well as you have banked, you will be sure to succeed." End quote. During this time, he became an accomplished platform speaker. As well as his regular preaching, he became involved in the Apocrypha controversy, which raged fiercely in Brechin. Guthrie was no ivory tower theologian, and his common touch made him radical and successful in both his social reform and his evangelistic endeavours. He says, "If ministers were less shut up in their own shells and had more common sense and knowledge of the world, they would cling less tenaciously to old forms, suitable enough to bygone, but not to the present times." He went on to prove this in his first charge in Aberloot, Angus, 1830 to 1837, by abolishing 2 Sunday services. They were replaced by a longer service at noon and an evening Bible class for young people aged 15 to 25. At the minister's class, Guthrie would work through the Westminster Shorter Catechism, give a shorter, simplified version of the earlier sermon, abundantly illustrated by examples and anecdotes, and test the knowledge of his students. As Guthrie reported in his autobiography, none of the services and ecclesiastical machinery at work did so much good, perhaps, as this class. This knowledge of the world infused Guthrie's preaching. He combined solid Reformed theology with a simple, accessible, if somewhat flowery style. He says, "I used the simplest, plainest terms, avoiding anything vulgar, but always, where possible, employing the Saxon tongue, the mother tongue of my hearers. I studied the style of the addresses which the ancient and inspired prophets delivered to the people of Israel, and saw how, differing from the dry disquisitions or a naked statement of truths, they abounded in metaphors, figures, and illustrations. I turned to the Gospels and found that he who knew what was in man, what could best illuminate a subject, win the attention and move the heart, used parables and illustrations, stories, comparisons drawn from the scenes of nature and familiar life." End quote. His great desire was to communicate the redeeming power of the gospel to those who were often shut out of the church in 19th century Scotland because of pew rents. Like Thomas Chalmers, Guthrie followed the parochial system of systematic visitation in defined districts and the biblical use of the offices of elders and deacons. His evangelism was relational, systematic, and always with a long-term vision for the transformation of the whole community. Called to Edinburgh in 1837, Guthrie became an associate minister at Old Grey Friars alongside John Sim. The city in which Guthrie arrived was growing rapidly in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. Poverty, drunkenness, vice, and all manner of degradation were never far from view. There is a famous story told in Guthrie's book Out of Harness that describes how Guthrie stood on George IV Bridge in Edinburgh, not long after arriving in Edinburgh. Looking down on his new parish of the Cowgate, he described a living stream of humanity in motion beneath his feet. A hand was laid on his shoulder, and he turned around to find the great preacher and social reformer, Dr. Thomas Chalmers. Guthrie recalls, quote, "Hopeful of success, he surveyed the scene beneath us, and his eye, which often wore a dreamy stare, kindled at the prospect of seeing that wilderness become an Eden, those foul haunts of darkness, drunkenness, and disease changed into dwellings of the righteous, where is heard the voice of melody. Contemplating the scene for a little in silence, all at once, with his broad Luther-like face glowing with enthusiasm, he waved his arm to exclaim, 'A beautiful field, sir, a very fine field of operation.'" Guthrie was appalled by what he saw around him on the streets of Edinburgh. Writing in 1872, he recalled, 35 years ago, on first coming to this city, I had not spent a month in my daily walks in our Cowgate and Grassmarket without seeing that with worthless, drunken and abandoned parents for their only guardians, there were thousands of poor innocent children whose only chance of being saved from a life of ignorance and crime lay in a system of compulsory education. Inspired by a cobbler from Portsmouth called John Pounds, who saved 500 ragged children from a life of neglect and delinquency, Guthrie was to become the Scottish apostle of the ragged school movement. There was already an industrial feeding school in Aberdeen, pioneered by Sheriff Watson in 1841, but the key difference was that Guthrie's ragged schools were always attended by choice rather than by coercion, or as an alternative to custody. Inspired by the Aberdeen School and a similar school established in Dundee in 1842, Guthrie began to gather those of like mind to rescue thousands of children who, as he said of one poor boy, were launched on a sea of human passions and exposed to 1,000 temptations, left by society more criminal than he to become a criminal and then punished for his fate, not his fault. The original ragged school brought together different responses to the needs of these desperate children: education, regular meals, clothes, industrial training, and Christian instruction. All this was done in an environment of discipline and structure, although there was never a sense that the schools were harsh or austere. Guthrie was no great fan of corporal punishment, and instead encouraged staff to win over children with kindness. He said, "These Arabs of the city are wild as those of the desert, and must be broken into 3 habits: those of discipline, learning, and industry, not to speak of cleanliness. To accomplish this, our trust is in the almost omnipotent power of Christian kindness. Hard words and harder blows are thrown away here. With these, alas, they are too familiar at home, and have learned to be as indifferent to them as the smith's dogs to the shower of sparks." Most of the ragged children who attended the schools did not remain overnight, but were in school for 12 hours in the summer and 11 hours in the winter. The day started at 8 a.m. with a rather painful sounding ablutions, and the children were dismissed at 7:15 p.m. after supper. Guthrie described the daily routine. He said, "In the morning they are to break their fast on a diet of the plainest fare, then march from their meal to their books. In the afternoon they are again to be provided with a dinner of the cheapest kind, then back again to school, from which, after supper, they return not to the walls of an hospital, but to their own homes. There, carrying with them a holy lesson, they may prove Christian missionaries to those dwellings of darkness and sin." What were the results? The statistics speak for themselves. The Edinburgh prison population in 1847, the first year of the operation of ragged schools in Edinburgh, consisted of 315 under-14s, 5% of the prison population. By 1851, the figure was 56 out of 5,869, a mere 1% of the prison population. Thomas Guthrie's name will forever be connected with the Free Church of Scotland Manse Fund. After the disruption of 1843, there was severe suffering as ministers and their families departed their churches and manses over the issue of state interference in the spiritual decision-making of the national church. The issue at stake was the headship of Christ over the church, an issue that dates back to Covenanting times in Scotland. It is a powerful testimony to the strength and feeling of these men that loss of heart and home was no deterrent to following their principles. Guthrie was a prominent leader within the disruption and must have been heartbroken to leave his recently built St John's Church in Edinburgh. Guthrie expressed serious concern that the Manse Fund would stretch the generosity of Free Church people to the limit, but he needn't have worried. After he had toured 13 synods and 58 presbyteries in less than a year, he was able to announce to the General Assembly of June 1846 that 116,370 had been raised. Along with the Ragged School, the Manse Fund was one of Guthrie's greatest legacies. It's unlikely that anyone else could have achieved what he did in such a short space of time. His energy and oratory enabled the Manse Fund to greatly exceed its original target. Numerous ministers and their families owed a huge debt of gratitude for the provision of resources to build manses so that the gospel could continue to prosper, not just in the Highlands, but across the whole of Scotland. Guthrie died in the early hours of Monday, 24th February 1873, with his faithful Highland nurse and his family at his bedside. It is said that with the exception of Dr. Thomas Chalmers and Sir James Simpson, Edinburgh had not seen a funeral like it in a generation. It was reported that 230 children from the original Ragged School attended and sang a hymn at the grave. One little girl was overheard saying, "He was all the father I ever knew." Amongst Guthrie's last words, he was heard to say, "A brand plucked from the burning." His legacy was that through his vision and love for his Saviour, the Ragged School movement was established, which in turn plucked thousands of little brands from a life of poverty and crime, and brought them to know the ultimate friend of sinners. No short article can do justice to a life such as Guthrie's. Time does not allow us to detail his involvement in the temperance movement and his fight against the drunkenness and dram shops which ruined the lives of thousands. He was also involved in the fight for Sabbath observance. He spoke prominently against slavery, was a strong supporter of Jewish missions, and was used under God in the Kilsyth revival of 1839. Along with Chalmers, Guthrie was hugely influential in Scottish church and civic life, and his legacy lives on. Perhaps Guthrie's greatest legacy to us today is one of biblical community engagement. If there was ever a time in the church's history when we needed to know how to do this, then it is surely today. Guthrie faced a huge challenge when he came to Edinburgh in 1837. His parish was poor, overcrowded, and soaked in drunkenness. Immorality was rampant and unchecked, and perhaps no more than 5% of the population darkened the door of a church. Does that sound familiar? As Guthrie visited homes, he witnessed cases of starvation and wrestled with what was an overwhelming range of social problems. We face similar challenges today, and we can learn so much from Guthrie's response. Guthrie didn't despair or retreat or create a little free church enclave within the city. He planned, he organised, he visited, he preached, and the effect was significant and lasting. It was said of Thomas Chalmers that his parochial system was, quote, "a glorious enterprise of Christian aggression upon the regions of popular ignorance," end quote. This similar approach was adopted by Guthrie, who explained, to change the face of a district required, in his opinion, a more extensive and efficient system of cultivation, a school for children, a church with its door open to the poorest of the inhabitants, and a large staff of zealous men and women, each with their own section of families to visit, and all working in harmony, like bees in a hive, under the direction of the minister, their captain, bishop, or superintendent, end quote. Surely this is what we need again today. We need a team around our ministers who can reach out to a local area and care for body and soul. We also need to think once again about schools with a Christian ethos, which reach out to the intergenerational family problems in our towns and cities. The great social issues of our age are surely family breakdown, debt, isolation, addiction, and poverty. As Guthrie argued time and again, the gospel is the answer. But this does not abdicate the church from responding with practical expressions of love and seeking to reach out to the broken and marginalised in our society. In order to do this, we need to work together to build God's kingdom. As Guthrie said, let each select their own manageable field of Christian work. Let us embrace the whole city and cover its nakedness, although with different denominations at work, it should be robed, like Joseph, in a coat of many colours. Let our only rivalry be the holy one of who shall do most and succeed best in converting the wilderness into an Eden, and causing the deserts to blossom as the rose.
Let's consider the Ragged Schools in a little more detail. In his autobiography, Thomas Guthrie reflected thus on the Ragged Schools. I never engaged in a cause, as a man and a Christian minister, that I believe on my deathbed I will look back on with more pleasure or gratitude to God than that he led me to work for Ragged Schools. I have the satisfaction, when I lay my head upon my pillow, of always finding one soft part of it, and that is that God has made me an instrument in his hand of saving many a poor creature from a life of misery and crime. Here is the mission statement of the original Ragged School Association, which Guthrie founded. It is the object of this association to reclaim the neglected and profligate children of Edinburgh by affording them the benefits of a good, common, and Christian education, and by training them to habits of regular industry, so as to enable them to earn an honest livelihood and fit them for the duties of life. The general plan upon which the schools shall be conducted shall be as follows, namely, to give the children an allowance of food for their daily support, to instruct them in reading, writing, and arithmetic, to train them in the habits of industry by instructing and employing them daily in such sorts of work as are suited to their years, to teach them the truths of the gospel, making the Holy Scriptures the groundwork of instruction. Later on, when it was objected by a Roman Catholic priest that Guthrie was turning children into Protestants, Guthrie reflected in this way: above the door of these ragged schools, men shall henceforth see an open Bible, this glorious text upon its page. Search the Scriptures. No man feels a more lively interest in these schools than I do. I have thought and pondered over them. I have prayed over them, and I am not ashamed to say I have wept over them. But, dear as they are to my heart, I say, perish the ragged schools if they are only to be kept up by parting with the Bible. That's from his autobiography and memoirs. Again, in his book Out of Harness, he says the following: we held that in a ragged school, whatever might be the case in other schools, the object aimed at could not be accomplished without the pure milk of God's word for those babes, and that the principle, although some good men seem to have lost sight of it in the dust of battle, was the irreconcilable and eternal difference between Protestantism and Popery, the principle that God has addressed his word to all the human family. And for a final glimpse of Guthrie as the convener of the ragged schools, let's look at what he looked for in a teacher. What I desiderate in all our officials is sincere piety, a warm Christian affection for the souls of these poor children, a mind which will not be content with a perfunctory discharge of duty, not even with remarkable success in the way of improving their intellects and reforming their outward habits, but a mind and soul which burns with love to Christ and will be satisfied with nothing short of seeing these children converted and saved. These quotes, and much more material related to the life and ministry of Thomas Guthrie and the Ragged Schools, can be found at www.thomasguthrie.org, that is O-R-G, a website that is maintained by Mr. Andrew Murray. We thank him for his article and his help with this episode, and if you've enjoyed learning something about Thomas Guthrie, then look out for our full interview with Andrew Murray, coming very soon to the podcast and to our YouTube channel. Thank you for listening to the Banner of Truth magazine podcast. To subscribe to the magazine in print or digital formats, or both, see the show notes or visit banneroftruth.org.